You just tased the Pentagon Colonel, you idiot, in the convenience store, bathed in yellow light. Rick Talbot kept laughing, pulling the trigger. I don't care what badge you wear. All I see is black skin. A few minutes later, the sky trembled as a convoy of military vehicles drove straight to the Havenbrook Police Station. And this time, the law was no longer his to command. Justice doesn't need to scream. It knows how to take revenge with silence and iron discipline. If that happened in your state, who would justice protect first? Which state are you in? Sunlight slanted through the dusty glass, breaking into streaks of light across the old tile floor. The small convenience store on the corner of Havenbrook was quiet, filled only with the steady hum of the ceiling fan and the crackling voice of an old radio playing an offbeat country song. Elijah Ward stepped in his uniform, perfectly pressed as if he were still on duty. The light reflected off the rows of medals on his chest, making the cashier, a young woman named Maria, instinctively stand a little straighter as she greeted him. Elijah simply nodded, his voice low and rough from years of command in the field. "A bottle of cold water, please." He stood tall, not looking around, just watching the rhythm of the small space as if everything still moved within the order and discipline of a man long trained to control his surroundings. The glass door opened again, the bell above it ringing with a dry chime. Rick Talbot walked in, his police shirt, slightly wrinkled eyes sweeping the room before fixing on the uniform ahead of him. He squinted, the corner of his mouth curving into a half sneer, half challenge. "Didn't know this neighborhood had medal wearers." Rick's voice rang out clearly enough to make Maria flinch. Elijah didn't turn, just reached into the fridge for the bottle, shutting the door with a firm motion. "I wear them to remind myself I served," he said evenly, "not to prove anything to anyone." Rick laughed, the sound rough and echoing through the room. He stepped closer, eyes scanning the shining metal on Elijah's chest. "Served. Here, you're walking around this broke neighborhood in a uniform. For what respect you think people should bow?" Maria stood behind the counter, hand still on the cash box, palms slick with sweat. Elijah lifted his head, his eyes showing no anger, only a cold clarity that made people step back. "I don't make anyone bow," he replied, "but I don't bow to ignorance." The air in the store thickened. Outside, the sun burned like molten metal, its glare catching the drifting specks of dust. Rick moved closer now, barely half a meter away. "You calling me ignorant?" he said slowly. Each word dragged out his voice, grinding like steel on stone. Elijah kept his calm tone. "I'm calling your behavior reckless, and recklessness in uniform is the most dangerous thing there is." Rick smirked. "Fine. Let's see if my law needs medals to earn respect." Maria took a step back, her heart pounding as condensation formed on the cold bottle in Elijah's hand, the droplets sliding down to the floor. Elijah set the bottle on the counter, his eyes never leaving the man in front of him. In that moment, every sound in the store vanished. No radio, no fan, only the heavy breathing of two men. Elijah saw in Rick's eyes the hollow kind of power he had known all his life, the kind that needed fear to feel real. "You should be careful how you use the law," he said quietly, his voice calm to the point of menace, "because once the law is abused, it stops protecting anyone." Rick gave a short, sharp laugh. "You think that rank on your chest keeps you safe? Around here, I'm the one who decides." Elijah lowered his head, opened the bottle, and took a sip. "If you really believe that," he said, setting the bottle down so gently it made no sound, "then you don't understand a thing about honor." Rick stepped closer, his breath thick with coffee and smoke. Maria looked around, her hands trembling as she sensed something about to explode in the heavy air. Elijah stayed where he was, unmoving, unflinching, his gaze locked on the man before him. The silence stretched thin as a wire ready to snap at a touch. Rick let out a short, jagged laugh. "You're old soldier. Your time's done. Now it's people like me who make the rules." Elijah nodded, his eyes steady. "And that's exactly when this country forgets why it ever fought." At that instant, sunlight cut through the glass and hit Rick's face, making his eyes blaze with anger. He turned sharply, then stopped at the door. The silence was so deep that the click of a pen cap behind the counter sounded loud. Elijah knew this wasn't wasn't just a clash between two men, it was a clash between two beliefs, one built on duty, the other on power. Rick narrowed his eyes, almost growling. "We'll see, Colonel, we'll see which of us really holds the law." Elijah didn't answer. He looked outside where the sunlight shimmered on the pavement like a sheet of glass. Each second dragged by heavy and slow, and in that stillness he understood this noon would carry more than dust and sweat. It would carry the scent of something about to burn, maybe honor, maybe faith. Rick left, leaving behind the faint odor of rage hanging in the air. Maria watched him go, then turned to Elijah, unsure what to say. He gave a faint smile, his eyes still deep and calm. "Everything begins in silence," he murmured almost to himself, "and sometimes it ends with an explosion." Elijah paid, picked up the bottle, and walked outside. The sunlight was still golden, but now its glow seemed heavier, thicker, as if the world around him were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The glass door closed behind Elijah, the small bell above it ringing once before fading. The space seemed to shrink, the light inside the store dimming under a thin layer of dust. Maria stood behind the counter, sensing something slipping beyond the bounds of normal. Rick stayed where he was, his eyes fixed on Elijah's straight back. That look no longer held mere suspicion, but an old hatred, the kind he had carried for years under the guise of keeping order. Rick took a step forward, his hand resting on the grip of his taser, his voice hoarse and tight. "Show me your identification." Elijah turned the light, catching half his face, reflecting in calm eyes, still as a lake before the wind. "You're violating procedure," he said slowly, his voice so even it could unnerve a man. "No one has the right to demand papers without legal cause." Rick frowned, his tone sharp. "I see a man in uniform without a mission. That's reason enough." Elijah set the bottle on the counter, his hands thick and sun-browned but steady. "I don't need to prove my innocence," he said, "because I haven't done anything wrong." Rick laughed, the sound warped and metallic echoing off the walls. "You sound like a handbook, but here I am, the procedure." He drew the taser fully, the metal glinting under the pale light. Maria held her breath, her heart racing, eyes wide as she saw the flicker of electricity at the muzzle. Elijah didn't move back, didn't try to argue. He looked straight at Rick without anger or fear, only a deep gaze that seemed to see through him. "You're turning yourself into the shadow of the law," he said, his voice rough, and shadows never keep their balance. The moment was so brief it almost didn't exist. Rick clenched his teeth, tightening his grip. A blue flash burst out, the sharp crack split in the air like thunder. The current shot forward, wrapping around Elijah's body, jerking him violently as his back slammed into the shelf. The bottle fell from his hand, shattering water splashing across the floor, mingling with the flickering light. Maria screamed, her voice breaking against the hiss of electricity. Elijah collapsed, eyes still open, his lips pressed shut to hold in any sound. For an instant, the image of a soldier symbol of discipline and honor, brought down by a petty, cruel show of power, split the silence like a bright, jagged wound. Rick inhaled hard, his chest rising and falling, his breath heavy with anger. "See," he said quietly, "it's that easy." He leaned over Elijah, his eyes stripped of doubt, filled instead with warped satisfaction. Maria trembled as she stepped out from behind the counter, tears streaking down her face. "You just assaulted a military officer," she cried, her voice thin, collapsing against the floor. Rick spun around, his hand raised in warning. "This is a routine inspection," he said, his tone dropping low but edged with force. "Anyone who interferes gets arrested." Elijah struggled to push himself up, his body still shaken from the electric shock. He lifted his head, breathing heavily, but his eyes had not lost their focus. He looked at Rick, his lips trembling slightly, though his voice stayed firm. "You just struck at the honor of a nation, and you will answer for it." Rick frowned, but the anger inside him drowned out any trace of reason. He laughed, a cold, cruel laugh. "Honor," he said. All I see is a man on the floor because I said so. The words made Maria step back, her hand covering her mouth. Outside, sunlight pierced through the glass, reflecting off the tiles where Elijah lay, creating a glare so bright it burned the eyes. He tried to lift himself again, his hand trembling but refusing to give in. Rick saw it, and in his gaze there was a flicker, a very small one, of hesitation. But then he turned away, walking toward the door, muttering, "That's the price of not following orders." Elijah bowed his head, drawing in a deep breath, his eyes closing for a moment. Everything seemed to stop. The radio had gone silent, and only the sound of water dripping from the broken bottle remained. Maria knelt beside him, her hands shaking. I'll call an ambulance," she said, her voice breaking. Elijah shook his head slightly, his breathing uneven. "Don't," he said. "Remember what you saw. The truth sometimes needs to stay untouched before people can bury it." Maria looked at him, her eyes blurred with tears, then turned to Rick, who was facing away, sliding his weapon back into its holster with smug composure. She knew that moment the flash of current in the Havenbrook noon would not end here. It would spread like a burn crawling across metal, like a sound that lingers long after thunder fades. Elijah leaned his head against the wall, closing his eyes, feeling each pulse echo through his chest. He knew a line had been crossed, and from that point on, those who once believed in justice would have to learn again how to stand right in the place where justice itself had fallen. The air inside the convenience store grew thick, the burnt smell from the electric charge still hanging in the narrow space like a thin thread of smoke tightening around the throat, making it hard to breathe. The radio crackled with a distorted version of the American national anthem, the drum beats off rhythm, each harsh note striking like mockery. Elijah still lay there, his body twitching slightly, a black burn mark seared into the collar of his uniform, tiny specks of dust clinging to his shoulder like traces of humiliation. Rick stood a few steps away, taser still in hand, his eyes gleaming with shallow satisfaction. "Now you know who's in charge here," he said, his voice strained with excitement. But in the silence, the words fell like a confession. From Elijah's pocket, a plastic card slipped out, falling onto the wet tile floor. Light from the window caught it, reflecting the sharp, cold letters, Colonel, U.S. Army. Maria saw it first, her eyes widening, her hands still trembling from fear. She took a half step forward, her voice breaking with shock. "Oh my God, he's a colonel!" The words cut through the heavy air like a blade. Rick spun around, a flicker of unease crossing his face before it hardened into a faint smile. He bent down, picked up the ID, brushed the dust off with his thumb, then looked up at Elijah, who was struggling to sit upright. "Fake Rick," said his voice rough, drawing out each word, trying to sound cold, but betraying the edge of doubt. "You people know how to play roles now. Dress like that, who can tell what's real?" Maria gasped, disbelief tightening her chest. "Are you insane? No one fakes a military rank in a real uniform like this." But Rick ignored her, his gaze moving over the shining metals before stopping at the nameplate on Elijah's chest. He smirked, the smile sharp as glass. "Ward. Elijah Ward. Sounds impressive, but around here no one's impressive." He tossed the ID to the floor, where it slid across the wet tiles, the window light flashing off it once more like a streak of fire. Elijah pressed his hand to the floor, his breath still heavy, but his voice came out steady and cold. "You just assaulted a man carrying the honor of a nation," he said, locking eyes with Rick, unblinking, "and that nation will remember your name." Each word landed like a stone sinking into deep water. Rick burst into harsh laughter, the sound dry and grating, but no one in the store joined him. Maria backed away slowly, her gaze shifting between the two men, between one in uniform, who carried the arrogance of borrowed power, and the other older fallen, yet still holding the gaze of a man who understood what duty truly meant. Rick clicked his tongue, bent down to pick up the ID again, squinting at the signature in the corner, then snorted. Not bad looks, almost real, enough to fool anyone who didn't see it happen. He tossed the card at Elijah's chest. It hit and slid to the wet floor, carried by the spreading water from the broken bottle. Elijah reached for it, his hand trembling slightly, the current still lingering in his body. He set the card on his knee, wiped off the dirty water with his sleeve, then lifted his head, his voice low, each word cutting through the air like a blade. "You'd think power comes from a weapon," he said, "but in truth it comes from the choice not to use it." Rick clenched his jaw, veins rising on his neck. He stepped back, then forward again as if afraid to show weakness. "Listen, soldier, I don't care where you came from or what title you wear. In Havenbrook, I'm the law. Got that?" Elijah looked at him, his eyes steady, unnervingly calm. "If the law is in the hands of someone who's forgotten who it was made to protect, then it's no longer law." Rick growled, "Shut up. You're resisting an officer." "I'm speaking to a man betraying the very badge he's proud of, Elijah," replied his hoarse voice, carrying each word into the narrow space between them, echoing like metal, striking the hollow inside of steel. Maria stepped back farther, tears streaming down her face, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. She knew something terrible had just happened, something no one in that room could undo. The ID lay on the floor, catching the light like a reminder, like proof no one could deny. Elijah exhaled sharply, lifted his head, his gaze no longer fixed on Rick but on the ceiling, on the small American flag hanging crooked in the corner, swaying gently in the fan's breeze. His voice came out low, smoky. "Every honor has its price, and someone just bet his life to pay it." Rick laughed a twisted sound, then walked toward the door, pausing for a beat before stepping out. "Keep that card, Colonel," he said, drawing out the words, "it won't save you." The door swung open, light pouring in, casting across Elijah's face, revealing the red mark on his neck. Maria watched through her tears as Rick walked away, his figure tall against the blinding sun, his shadow stretching long and curved like a blade, cutting through the street. Elijah looked down at the card in his hand, turned it over, and the embossed words, "United States Army," glinted gold. In that instant he knew this was no longer between two men, but between a belief and a system tearing off its own mask of justice. And the burnt smell still lingered as if it knew the story had only just begun. Wind from the street slipped through the door cracks, carrying the heat of Havenbrook's noon and sweeping the dust off the glass frame. Sunlight slanted straight onto the pavement, so bright it blurred the reflection of the figures inside the store. The burnt smell lingered, mixed with the scent of melted plastic from the taser and cold sweat. Rick Talbot stood breathing hard, his palms still tingling from the discharge. Elijah Ward sat against the shelf, his dark eyes deep and steady, showing neither anger nor plea, only a silence heavy as stone. Outside, a few passers-by had stopped. They stared through the streaked glass where the light reflected off a faded uniform, and the anguished face of a black man just struck down. Among them, Darius Cole, a young delivery worker, pulled out his phone, his hands shaking so hard the image blurred on the screen. His voice broke through the fear uneven. He got tased just for being black. The question rang through the sunlight, through the pounding hearts of those watching, like a bell shattering paralysis. A middle-aged woman nearby raised a hand to her mouth while a small boy clung to her arm and whispered, "Mom, is he a bad guy?" The mother didn't answer, her eyes fixed on the man lying on the tiled floor where the ID still glimmered, reflecting the words, "Colonel, U.S. Army." Rick heard the murmurs outside and spun around, his face flushed red, sweat soaking his collar. He saw phones pointed at him, eyes staring unflinching, furious. Heat rose up his neck as he lifted the taser toward the door, shouting voice raw, "I'm doing my job. Back off, everybody, back off." His yell bounced off the walls, mixing with the distorted strains of the unfinished national anthem, still playing from the radio. Outside, no one moved back, and Darius kept his phone, raised the screen light shining on his face, one filled with both fear and defiance. Elijah tried to push himself up his back, scraping the cold floor. Slowly, he lifted his head, his breath heavy, but his voice clear, low and deep, like the sound of earth echoing. "Power doesn't make you great, Rick," he said, each word slow, sinking into the air. how you use it does." Rick jerked around, eyes wide, as if hearing a charge he couldn't deny. He stepped forward, raising the taser, pointing it straight at Elijah's chest, the charge not yet reloaded. The store seemed to hold its breath, the only sound the faint click of metal as Rick's hand tightened on the grip. Maria sobbed, "Don't do this, he's already down." But Rick didn't hear, or maybe he refused to. In that moment, the sunlight through the glass hit Rick's face directly, making his eyes wild with rage. He looked around and saw his own reflection in the window, a twisted, tense face, the strained smile of a man losing his humanity without realizing it. Elijah still sat there, looking up unflinching, his gaze cutting through Rick as if seeing straight into him. Darius gripped his phone tighter, one thought filling his mind. The world needs to see this. His finger brushed the screen, the live icon appeared, and in an instant the images began to spread across social media, flowing like fire over water. The light flickered in the phone's frame, Rick's voice echoing through the speaker. "I'm a police officer. Step back." And right after came Elijah's voice, low, steady, resolute. "You're disgracing the very uniform you wear." Those words slipped past the glass into Holmes' devices and minds scrolling through their feeds. Maria looked toward Darius, noticing the glow from his phone reflecting on his face, a light no longer born of fear, but of action. She understood at that instant that everything had gone beyond control. Outside, the crowd was silent, held still by something greater than fear. A man muttered, "And they call this justice." Another gripped his daughter's hand, their eyes meeting, quiet but fierce. Meanwhile, Rick kept shouting, but his voice now echoed hollowly in the air, stripped of its power. Elijah tilted his head, breathing hard, but in his eyes was a strange light, the light of truth just revealed. He understood that sometimes no resistance is needed. Just existing at the right moment is enough to expose every lie. Darius lowered his phone hands, trembling, his heart pounding like a war drum. "They're watching," he whispered, voice shaken. Maria turned toward Elijah and he gave a faint nod. That nod said nothing, yet it carried more weight than any declaration could. The store was now hauntingly still. Only the ceiling fan creaked, Rick's heavy breathing filled the air, and the bell above the door chimed softly in the wind. Outside, the city of Havenbrook still blazed under the sun, but from that moment the light had changed. It was no longer the light of a calm noon, it was the light of truth, rising sharp, painful, and impossible to escape. Night fell slowly over Havenbrook, the small city shrinking into itself after a brief storm under the blazing noon sun. Inside the police station, pale fluorescent light spilled over cracked walls, casting a dull glow on faded warning signs. Rick Talbot sat hunched over the desk, pen in hand, his eyes tense, his breath uneven, like a man who had just walked away from an impact he couldn't yet comprehend. On the page, he wrote, "Suspect resisted suspicious behavior, attempted to obstruct an officer in duty." The words flowed quickly, evenly, as if he had long mastered the habit of turning actions into reports, truth into emotionless sentences. Nearby, the air conditioner hissed softly, cold air spreading through the room but doing nothing to cool the heat burning in Rick's chest. He paused, lifted his eyes toward the bulletin board in front of him, where photos from gatherings framed commendations and the slogan, "Serve and Protect," hung. The phrase made the corner of his mouth twitch, a reflex beyond his control. He inhaled deeply, added a few more lines, then folded the file and slid it across the table to the man sitting opposite him. The Havenbrook Police Chief, a short, heavy-set man with a gray face aged by cigarettes and years of compromise. The chief glanced at the top lines, signed his name without reading closely. "All right, that's done. Let the media department handle it." His tone was flat, detached, as if this were just another routine task. Rick stood buttoned his shirt, his eyes flickering with fatigue, before pride masked it again. "I followed procedure," he said. "He refused orders. I had to act." The chief took a drag from his cigarette, exhaled smoke, his voice gravelly. "Right, and soon you'll need that procedure to protect yourself. Take a few days off, Talbot. This will blow over." He stubbed out the cigarette, turned his chair away, signaling the conversation was over. Rick left the room, his black shoes striking the floor with hard, dry sounds that echoed down the long hallway, mingling with the creak of the old ceiling fan. At the end of the corridor, Elijah Ward sat in the holding cell. The light cut through the bars, falling across his sun-darkened face, illuminating the scorched mark on his uniform collar. He sat upright, hands resting on his thighs, neither shrinking nor angry, as if he were back in the barracks waiting for orders. His gaze lingered on a crack in the opposite wall, listening to the footsteps approaching, stopping before his cell door. Rick appeared, standing on the other side of the bars, his eyes caught between pride and the unease he refused to acknowledge. "Hope you learned your lesson," Rick said quietly, voice steady. "In Havenbrook, titles don't save anyone." Elijah looked at him, his eyes deep and still reflecting the cold blue light of the fluorescent lamp. "When people can't find justice," he said, his voice low and steady, "they'll go looking for it, even if they have to go through men like you." Rick opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His throat tightened and he turned away. The iron door closed with a metallic clang that echoed down the hallway. Elijah watched him go, his eyes holding no hatred, only something deeper pity perhaps for both the man and the system he served. When the footsteps faded, Elijah took a slow breath and lifted his head toward the ceiling. The chill from the wall seeped into his skin, sharpening the sense of isolation, yet inside him stirred something else, the feeling of a man who had seen battlefields and knew the weight of silence before a storm. He turned toward the side where an old payphone hung on the wall. The cord was coiled and worn, its silver paint peeling, but the indicator light still blinked green. He stood, walked over, lifted the receiver, and dialed a short sequence of numbers he had memorized years ago. A connection click followed by an automated female voice. "Department of Defense, please enter your communication code." Elijah spoke clearly. "Colonel Elijah Ward. Confirmation code 7A. There was a pause, then a real voice came through, calm and composed, carrying the tone of someone long accustomed to discipline. "Colonel Ward. We're listening." Elijah drew in a breath, his eyes fixed on the light spilling through the bars onto the floor. He spoke slowly, each word falling into the air like a brief command. "I was assaulted while in uniform. The perpetrator is a Havenbrook police officer. The incident was recorded. I request immediate contact with the Pentagon Command Office." Silence held for a few seconds, then the voice returned colder, sharper. "Maintain your position, Colonel. From this point on, it's no longer under their jurisdiction." Elijah set the receiver down, the sound of plastic against metal, soft but firm. He sat back in his chair, fingers interlaced, his gaze fixed on the small patch of light near the door. Outside, the city of Havenbrook lay in stillness, the wind moving through the rows of power lines, street lights casting weak yellow halos onto the pavement. Somewhere out there, one man had fabricated a report to save himself, another had made a call to awaken a sleeping system, and between them lay the truth, cold unseen but beginning to stir. Night in Havenbrook settled like a layer of false calm. The weak streetlights stretched down the narrow road where the heat of the afternoon still lingered. In a cramped third-floor apartment of an old complex, a fan creaked as it turned, blending with the faint clatter of keyboard keys. On the dim laptop screen, Darius Cole sat hunched over a wooden chair, eyes fixed on the video he had filmed earlier that day. The bluish light washed over his young face, pale with emotions that hadn't yet faded. He replayed it again and again, stopping at the frame where Elijah Ward fell, the flash of electricity cutting across the scene, and Elijah's voice, low, rough but chillingly clear, rang out, "You're violating procedure." Darius stared at the footage, his hands trembling fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Rick Talbot's voice cut through the crackle of the taser. "I am the procedure," followed by the thud of a body hitting the floor and the crash of a bottle shattering against tile. Each time he heard it, Darius's chest tightened. He took a deep breath, moved the cursor, and typed a title for the video. He tased a colonel. The white words glowed cold on the black background. He sat still for a few seconds, then pressed upload. The screen spun with the loading icon, its flickering light reflecting in his eyes, and when the progress bar hit 100%, a breeze slipped through the open window, carrying the bark of a distant dog and the damp scent of night. He didn't know that what he'd just done was about to wake the entire nation. 10 minutes later, the first reshare appeared. Then 10, then 50, then 100. A popular account commented, "He really was a colonel." Another wrote, "If he weren't a colonel, would anyone care?" That question spread faster than the video itself. The hashtag tased the wrong man began showing up first under small posts, then across Twitter's front page. Darius saw the notifications flashing on his phone, the view count climbing every second. He smiled faintly, though the smile carried fear. "People need to see this," he murmured, his eyes still locked on the screen where Elijah's face appeared one last time, head lifted, as he spoke his final words before collapsing. Outside in apartments and late-night cafes, screens across the city lit up with the same frame, a police officer in a blue uniform aiming his taser, and a black man in military dress, head held high, saying firmly, "You're violating procedure." That line, repeated on thousands of devices, suddenly became a symbol of defiance. In the comment sections, people argued, raged, grieved, and fell silent. A veteran wrote, "I once fought for this country. Now, I'm not sure it still fights for me." A middle-aged woman posted, "This is why I don't let my son walk alone." And among the chaos of opinions, one short line spread tens of thousands of times. "If justice needs a uniform to be respected, then it's not justice at all." Near midnight, online newspapers began updating their breaking news. Havenbrook Police accused of assaulting military officer. The flashing headlines on screens seemed to stop the entire city in its tracks. Darius leaned back in his chair, the sound of notifications buzzing nonstop from his phone before he quietly turned it off. He opened the window and looked out, seeing houses still lit across the street. Somewhere in that same city, Rick Talbot was probably trying to sleep while Colonel Ward remained locked in a holding cell. Darius thought of Elijah's gaze, the calm, unwavering look that could make a person feel ashamed. At 2 a.m, the national late-night broadcast replayed the video. The anchor spoke slowly in a neutral tone. A video circulating on social media shows a police officer using a taser on a man in military uniform, later identified as Colonel Elijah Ward. The Havenbrook Police Department stated they are conducting an internal investigation. The words "internal investigation" rang dry and hollow, as if every phrase had been pre-programmed to protect silence. By early morning, the city awoke to a wave of outrage. In cafes, offices, and buses, everyone was talking. A young woman told her friend, "I've watched it 10 times and it still gives me chills." An older man lowered his newspaper and muttered, "And they call that law enforcement." At the Havenbrook Police Station, the main doors stayed shut. Reporters crowded outside the gate, microphones raised, but no one would answer. Inside, the police chief sat before a screen, replaying the video, sweat gathering on his forehead. Rick Talbot stood behind him, his face tight, eyes bloodshot. "We'll handle the media," the chief said, his voice trembling. "We just need a few days." But those few days no longer existed. By the time the sun rose over Havenbrook's skyline, the video had surpassed 5 million views. The hashtag tased the wrong man still topped the trend chart. Major news outlets were calling demanding confirmation requests in interviews. In Washington, the Pentagon had already received an official report, and Darius Cole, the student who had pressed upload, sat quietly by his small window, looking down at the street. In the morning light, he saw children walking to school, their laughter clear and distant, untouched by what was unfolding beyond. He realized then that the video he had shared no longer belonged to him. It had become a testimony to a moment when justice, though struck down, still found its voice. At Fort Armitage, the night wind swept across the rows of flagpoles, carrying a chill and the faint clang of metal striking metal. In the third-floor conference room, white lights glared overhead, and the large screen at the center played the video now spreading across the nation. The blue glow from the footage washed over the faces of men in dark uniforms, silent, motionless. General Jonathan Abrams stood at the head of the table, hands clasped before him, eyes fixed on the image of Elijah Ward collapsing to the floor. The flash of electricity and the voice that followed. "You're violating procedure." The sound filled the room so sharp and raw that everyone could feel the humiliation and fury woven into each word. Abram set his hand on the table, his voice low and resonant, carrying the weight of a man used to commanding in war. "This is no longer an individual act. This is an insult to the system itself." A few officers lowered their heads while a young secretary in the corner stared at the floor, lips pressed tight. The light from the screen carved the deep lines across Abrams' face. He looked around the room, his gaze settling on a younger officer near the end of the table. Colonel Samuels, newly promoted, eyes bright with conviction. Samuels looked up, his voice calm but clear. "What do you intend to do, General?" The question cut through the silence like a blade. Abrams didn't answer right away. He stepped toward the screen, freezing the frame on Rick Talbot taser, raised the reflection of light twisting across his face. "Look at this." Abrams said, his tone firm but heavy with restrained force. "This is the moment when a man in the name of law fired on the embodiment of honor, and the entire country is watching." A heavy silence settled over the room, thick as lead. Abrams went on, his voice steady, but each word landing like a hammer. "If we stay silent today, tomorrow someone will fire on the flag. Justice cannot wear the wrong uniform. We will not allow cowardice to represent this institution." The officers exchanged glances, none speaking, but in their eyes outrage was turning into resolve. Abrams returned to the table, signaling to his aide, who brought over a folder. On its cover, the red letters read, "Operation Internal Integrity." He opened it, signed the authorization, and handed it to Samuels. "Assemble the task force. I want Havenbrook Station sealed within 6 hours. No press leaks. This is a direct order." One officer stood trying to steady his voice. "Sir, that's a civilian zone. We'll need clearance from Homeland Security." Abrams turned to him, his gaze cold as steel. "You think an officer assaulting a man in uniform is a civilian matter? From this point forward, this falls under military authority. I'll take full responsibility." He paused, sweeping his eyes across the room, his tone dropping but striking with the weight of command. When a policeman dares to pull the trigger on a symbol of the nation that's not power, it's betrayal. Outside the conference room, a long hallway led to the quiet parking lot. Darkness covered the rows of deep blue armored vehicles. The red beacon on the watchtower, rotating slowly like the steady heartbeat of a massive machine waiting to be awake. Abrams stepped out, the wind tugging at his coat, the metallic scent of weaponry heavy in the air. He turned to Samuels, his voice lower but firm. "Do you know where I was when my own soldiers were treated like criminals because of their skin color? I stayed silent then. Not this time." Samuels nodded, his hand resting on the file, feeling the weight of the decision that had just been signed. Close to midnight, the convoys began to start their engines. The heavy rumble filled the open yard. Headlights cut through the darkness, glinting off pressed uniforms. A line of soldiers stood at attention, the commanding officer shouting orders. No one spoke beyond what was necessary, only the grind of tires on asphalt and the clang of steel doors sealing shut. From his office window, Abrams watched, his eyes no longer cold but burdened. He knew that once those vehicles left the base, it wouldn't just be an investigation beginning, it would be a confrontation between two systems, one built on discipline, the other on reckless power. As the convoy rolled through the gates, the red beacon turned slowly above, reflecting off the large Fort Armitage sign. On the conference room computer screen, the video of the incident replayed from the start, Elijah Ward's voice echoing once more, steady, unbroken. "You're violating procedure." Abrams looked toward the screen, pressed his lips together, then turned away. Sir Samuel said quietly from behind, "You think they know what's coming?" Abrams paused, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the headlights had become a fading streak of light. "No," he said, "but they're about to learn what justice really means." Over Havenbrook, the clouds sank low, the sound of military engines rolling in the distance, blending with the wind like the first drum beats of an unspoken war. Somewhere in the night, a confrontation without declaration had already begun. The night over Havenbrook was heavy, the sky buried under thick clouds that swallowed the moon. Inside the police station, the fluorescent lights flickered weakly, breaking into uneven pulses across the scratched wooden desk. The air was dense with the blend of old coffee, cigarette smoke, and sweat seeping into every breath. Rick Talbot sat before the wall-mounted TV, watching himself on screen, the same footage now shaking the nation. His face twisted under the store's harsh light taser, raised shouts echoing. "You're violating procedure." The words filled the small room, and Rick jumped up, hurling the cup in his hand to the floor. Glass shattered the sound, scattering through the duty room. Collins leaned against the wall, holding a file, his eyes tense as he watched his partner. His voice came out hesitant, low, as if even speaking might make things worse. "He really is a colonel," Collins said. "The Pentagon confirmed it. His name's on the officer roster at Fort Armitage." Rick froze his eyes wide for a few seconds, then forced a dry laugh. "So what, cops are still the law? Colonel General, it doesn't matter. I'm the one with authority on the streets." His voice was rough, trying to sound steady, but his hand trembled as he pulled a cigarette from his pocket. Collins said nothing for a long moment. Outside, the wind howled past the old windows, carrying the faint sound of cars from downtown. The late-night news played on every channel, each voice different, but saying the same thing: Havenbrook Police under investigation after using force on a military officer. Collins set the file down, his tone quiet but heavy. "No, Rick, the law just changed hands." Rick looked up, smirking. "The law never changes. People just get weak." Collins exhaled, stepping closer. "You don't get it. They've sent in the military. They've locked down our data systems. This isn't internal anymore." Rick stubbed out the cigarette, the red ember dying between his fingers, smoke curling through them. "The military," he repeated, as if mocking the word. "Let's see what they can do. I didn't do anything wrong. I did what others are too scared to." Collins stayed silent. He knew explanations no longer mattered. Out in the hallway, the lights flickered, the power wavering as a storm rolled in. Rain began tapping against the metal roof, its rhythm mixing with the TV broadcast, replaying an interview from Washington. A spokesperson stood outside the Pentagon saying, "The case is under review at the highest level. No one stands above the law." The voice poured into the room deep and cold as Rick flung his half-lit cigarette against the wall. He turned to Collins, his voice sharp. "Look at them. They always play the heroes. They need a villain to blame, and they chose me. I won't apologize for doing my job." Collins replied evenly, though his eyes were tired. "You don't get it. Sometimes duty doesn't save anyone, especially when it's done the wrong way." Rick slammed his hand on the table. the sound cracking, cutting through the room. I didn't do anything wrong. I did what everyone else thinks. You're all like me, just too afraid to act. Collins stepped back, fear flickering in his eyes. He knew Rick was losing control, not out of fear, but from the shock of having his power, his identity stripped away after years of living inside the uniform. At that moment, the desk phone rang sharply. Collins moved to answer the voice on the other end, urgent. Headquarters wants the full report within 2 hours. A federal inspection team is on its way. He hung up and turned to Rick, but his colleague was already standing by the window. The streetlight cast his face half in glow, half in shadow. They can send the whole world here, Rick said quietly, but I won't apologize. I did what they all want to see, except I was the one who actually did it. He turned back, voice rising, eyes burning red. I won't apologize. I did what everyone else thinks. The shout ripped through the room, bouncing off the walls, striking the ceiling, falling back like metal, dropped into a void. For a moment, no one spoke. Collins looked at him, his eyes filled with both pity and dread. He knew everything was being recorded. The small recorder on the table had been on since the start of the shift, its red light still blinking steadily. Rick hadn't noticed, still speaking, each word landing like a hammer. I keep order. I uphold the law. If justice has grown weak, that's not my fault. Collins swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the recorder's light, knowing that every word Rick spoke was cutting away his last chance at redemption. An hour later, when Rick left the room, the lights in the station still flickered, the TV still replaying the same video, the same line. You're violating procedure. Across the city, a new audio clip began circulating online, the voice of a man speaking with pride and madness intertwined. I won't apologize. I did what everyone else thinks. The phrase spread faster than light, shared by millions, becoming a symbol of a man's downfall and of a faith collapsing with him. Rick Talbot sat alone in the dark office, listening to the rain outside, realizing that the sleeplessness now consuming him would never end because it no longer belonged to him alone, but to an entire system exhausted by its own need to justify itself. Dawn came slowly to Havenbrook, the sky veiled in mist light, slipping through low rows of trees and falling onto the damp streets. Morning papers landed on doorsteps, the scent of fresh ink still clinging to them. On the front page of the National Herald, a photograph filled half the space, Elijah Ward in handcuffs between two police officers. The light in the image was blurred, his face streaked with sweat, yet his eyes remained steady, unbowed, as if shackles could not make him yield. Above the photo, a headline in bold black letters read, "Who protects the protector?" The question cut through the page like a blade, piercing the reader's conscience. Small cafes around the town square opened earlier than usual, the hiss of espresso machines blending with low murmurs of conversation. Everyone was talking about the same thing, the viral video, the man in uniform, the image of him being led away in the dark. An elderly veteran unfolded the newspaper, read slowly, then set it down, his eyes blurred with emotion. He told the waiter, "I've seen men fall for the flag on the battlefield, but I never thought I'd live to see a man in uniform fall in the heart of America." His words silenced the room. Outside, passers-by stopped. Some took photos of the front page, others simply stood still, their expressions heavy. By mid-morning, the street outside Havenbrook Police Station was packed. People gathered carrying candles and small signs reading "Justice" for Elijah Ward. The soft glow of candlelight mingled with the pale morning sun, creating a scene both peaceful and fierce. A line of veterans stood at the front shoulders, draped in worn jackets, old service pins catching the light. They didn't chant or raise banners. They simply stood in silence, staring at the building where Elijah was being held. In the crowd, a young woman held up a newspaper, her voice trembling as she read the headline aloud, "Who protects the protector?" Around her, people nodded, and some began to cry not from pity, but from the realization that the line between justice and power had been erased. In Washington, major media networks had joined the story. The morning broadcast on the national channel replayed images of the hundreds of candles burning outside the station, intercut with a brief statement from the Defense Department spokesperson: "We have made contact with service member Elijah Ward. The investigation is being handled with the highest priority." The words sounded like a promise, but to the people of Havenbrook, action was what they awaited. Inside his small cell, Elijah watched the first light of morning slip through the narrow window, reflecting off his hands and the silver glint of the cuffs. He didn't know that outside the city was lighting his name with candles, the light of faith, the kind that no darkness could ever extinguish. While outside the police station, the crowd kept growing, carrying candles and banners. Inside, Rick Talbot sat silently in his office. Morning light filtered through the narrow window bars, spilling pale streaks across the worn floor. The newspaper lay open on his desk, the front page photo of Elijah Ward in handcuffs still there, large enough to command every glance. Rick leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping a slow rhythm on the table, his eyes detached as if watching a story that had nothing to do with him. Outside the noise of the gathering rose voices, chants and car horns blending together. He looked down, saw the raised signs, the strained faces in the crowd. A faint, bitter smile touched his lips. "They just need someone to blame," he muttered, his voice hoarse from sleeplessness. The words dropped into the empty room like a stone fallen into a deep well unanswered. He stood, walked to the window, and pulled the blinds open. Light flooded in, cutting across his face, revealing lines of fatigue and an unraveling gaze. Rick stared at the crowd, searching for validation in his own words, but what he saw instead were calm, steady faces, people who didn't look like they were hunting for someone to blame. They held candles motionless, their flickering light reflecting in their eyes. A small boy stood beside his mother holding a sign scrawled with uneven letters, "Justice doesn't choose skin color." Rick turned away, lit a cigarette, and inhaled deeply. The smoke curled upward, fading into a soft haze, and for a moment he felt himself dissolving with it. The confidence he once had, the conviction that he had followed procedure, now hung over him like an invisible weight, suffocating, inescapable. Meanwhile, across the city, Elijah Ward lay in a military hospital room. White light from the ceiling washed over his face, tracing the veins along his neck. The steady beeping of the heart monitor mixed with the faint footsteps of doctors outside. He opened his eyes, staring at the ceiling where the light broke into uneven patterns of brightness and shadow. In his mind, the image of the candle-lit crowd outside the police station still lingered. People he had never met, never spoken to, yet now standing for a story that no longer belonged to one man alone. His voice came low, weak but clear. "No, they don't need someone to blame. They need someone to wake them up." The words carried softly through the room enough for the young nurse nearby to pause and look back at him in surprise. Elijah smiled faintly, the quiet smile of a man who understood that he had become a mirror, reflecting the pain of an entire society. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, feeling the chill of metal still pressed against his wrists where the cuffs had left their mark. Everything around him no longer felt like a symbol of humiliation, but of change. He didn't know how many people outside were speaking his name, but he understood that the story had moved beyond the personal. It had become a reminder that honor is not bound to rank. Justice does not belong to those in power, but to those who dare to face what is wrong. Across the city, Rick still sat in his stifling office, convinced he was being hunted, while Elijah lay quietly under the hospital light, sensing something far simpler. Neither of them was the center. Only 2 points where a turning moment had collided. One had caused the fracture, the other forced it into the light. And that morning, the city of Havenbrook was silent no more. On the top floor of the Pentagon, the conference room shone under white lights so quiet you could hear a pen tapping its rhythm on the wooden table. On the large screen, a map of the city of Havenbrook appeared red dots, marking the locations of public agencies, the police station circled in yellow. General Jonathan Abrams stood straight hand on the table, his face hardening as the video played again, the image of Elijah Ward collapsing, the flash of electricity and the voice, "You're violating procedure." Even after being heard dozens of times, the line made the whole room fall still. Abrams inhaled slowly, his gaze sweeping the officers around the table. "They forget that the uniform is the honor of the nation," he said, low and resonant. No one answered. A few officers bowed their heads. Others stared at the map, where the yellow dot for Havenbrook seemed to pulse like a heart beating fast inside the body of the country. The youngest aide in the room spoke cautiously. "Sir, this is a civilian area. If we intervene, we risk setting a dangerous precedent for civil-military relations." Abrams turned to him, his voice dropping and colder. "A dangerous precedent is when a police officer believes he can pull the trigger at the symbol of this country. I do not need more reasons to act." He stepped to the screen and paused on the frame of Rick Talbot with the taser raised, his face twisted with contempt. "Look closely," Abrams said. "This man did not only fire at one man, he fired at all of us." A more senior officer cleared his throat softly. "Sir, the media have exaggerated this. Public opinion is inflamed, but if the military moves into Havenbrook, people will say we are infringing on civil rights." Abrams met his gaze steady and unsparing. "I care for the law, not for excuses that hide cowardice. If this nation loses the ability to correct itself, we will help it remember." He signaled to the technical aide, and the map zoomed in the routes around the station, appearing in detail. Abrams turned back, light catching his glasses, his tone dry and firm. "Prepare a deployment plan. Havenbrook Station will be placed under temporary military supervision. All data and personnel are to be controlled within 6 hours. This is an order, not a suggestion." The room absorbed the command, the words settling like iron. Officers moved to their tasks. Papers shuffled, phones clicked, and the map on the screen glowed with the paths that would soon be taken. Outside the building, the night wind tapped the flagpoles, and the city of Havenbrook slept unaware of the lines being drawn on screens far above. Inside the Pentagon, men in uniform made decisions that would turn an incident into a national test of authority and accountability. Abrams watched the frozen image once more, the replay of the electric flash and the phrase that had traveled across the country. "You're violating procedure." He pressed his lips together, then signed the final authorization, folding the papers with the same steady hand he had used in the field. "We will act," he said quietly, as if to himself, not to show force, but to ensure that the symbol of our nation is never treated as a target. The atmosphere in the room shifted the moment those words were spoken. Everyone present exchanged glances, knowing this was a step could not be undone. One of the officers near the door spoke quietly. "Sir, do you believe this will make the public support us?" Abrams didn't look at him, only replied curtly, "I'm not doing this for support. I'm doing it to preserve the meaning of honor." He turned toward the large window, staring out at the gray sky over the Capitol, the city lights reflecting against the clouds like a dim sea of fire. In his mind, memories of old wars resurfaced where discipline had once been the line between life and death, between honor and disgrace. He knew that if Havenbrook was allowed to fade away as just another incident, that value would vanish like smoke. When the meeting ended, the others left one by one, leaving Abrams alone in the vast room. The map of Havenbrook still glowed onto the screen, the yellow dot now circled in red, a mark of direct intervention. He drew out his pen, signed the deployment order, his hand trembling slightly, though his gaze remained firm. The light from above reflected on the wet ink shimmering faintly. Outside the window, military vehicles had begun to start up, the heavy growl of engines reaching him like distant drums. Abrams stood watching, knowing everything was now in motion, and from this moment forward, Havenbrook would no longer be a quiet town on the map. A storm of power was coming, and this time it would sweep away even those who once believed themselves beyond judgment. Abrams remained still in the empty room, the white glow from the large screen casting his face in stark relief, making his eyes seem years older. Beyond the window, thick clouds drifted slowly, reflecting the blaze of the city lights below. He clasped his hands behind his back, watching the Havenbrook map shrink, the hundreds of red dots forming a tangled web of authority and boundary. None of the officers had dared to say aloud what all of them were thinking, that the military was about to cross the very line America had drawn to protect itself. Abrams knew it, but he also understood that silence in the face of injustice was sometimes more dangerous than conflict itself. He turned his voice, cutting through the still air, each word distinct and deliberate. The more civilian it is, the more it must understand where the line is. The words froze everyone still in the room, none daring even to breathe. He moved to the table where the file lay waiting, opened it, and looked over the pages filled with dense lines of operational directives. His voice dropped lower, not angry, but carrying the weight of a man long accustomed to making decisions that could not afford to be wrong. If that boundary is erased, he said, then the law becomes nothing but a weapon for the powerful, and honor turns into an ornament for those who know how to exploit it. The pen clicked softly against the paper, the dark blue ink flowing evenly, each stroke bearing the weight of a nation. When the final signature was complete, Abrams set the pen down and raised his head, his voice rough from tension but unwavering. The order takes effect immediately. Within 6 hours, Havenbrook will be under Pentagon control. The aide nodded, sliding the files into a leather case, a flicker of unease in his eyes. "Sir," he said quietly, "the media will react strongly. Should we wait for the Justice Department's report?" Abrams looked up, the light glinting off his thick lenses, his tone deepening. "Justice doesn't wait, and when people start fearing to enforce it, it's already dead." He turned away, walking slowly toward the door, each step heavy like the ticking of time about to move. Outside, the sound of soldiers' boots echoed down the corridor, the crackle of radios carrying the first lines of command. The emergency meeting had ended, but its orders had begun to live. When the conference room door closed, the glow from the large screen still illuminated the map of Havenbrook, its yellow borders now replaced by red. At Fort Armitage, convoys began rolling out from storage bays, the wheels grinding against concrete in a steady, thunderous rhythm, like the heartbeat of a vast machine awakening. Abrams stood at the window, watching the stretch of headlights form a ribbon of light, his hand tightening on his coat. He knew everything had moved beyond the limits of an isolated incident. This was no longer about a police officer or a soldier. It was a test of whether the nation still had the clarity to recognize who justice truly belonged to. And as the military vehicles left the base, their yellow beams cutting through the misty dawn, the storm of power had already begun, silent, fierce, and unstoppable, like the last breath before the sky itself split open. Dawn broke over Havenbrook, not with gentle light, but with the roar of engines in the distance. The ground trembled, the glass of nearby building quivered with each vibration, and sleepy residents stepped onto their porches, eyes fixed on the approaching sound. From the end of the main street, a convoy of armored military vehicles advanced, their wheels grinding against the asphalt with a deep, thunderous rhythm that echoed like a rolling storm. On the roofs, American flags whipped in the early light, the red stripes cutting through the mist, giving the air a sense of stern, unsettling gravity. The Havenbrook Police Station sat at the center of town, its steel gates gleaming in the glare of military headlights. When the convoy halted, a sharp command rang out, "Secure the perimeter, no one in or out." Rick Talbot burst from the main doors, shirt, wrinkled eyes shadowed from sleeplessness. He stared at the line of soldiers standing across the courtyard, rifles at their shoulders, faces composed but eyes steady and unyielding. "You have no authority here," Rick shouted, his voice cracking, straining to rise above the rumble of the still idling engines. He took a few steps forward, stomping hard as if the echo of his authority could still command obedience. But the officer at the front of the formation, tall and composed, turned to face him directly. His voice was calm but firm, cutting through the air. "When you assaulted a colonel, that authority ended." Rick froze his face, draining of color. Behind him, fellow officers clustered at the doorway, their expressions a mix of fear and confusion. Collins appeared on the steps, a file clutched in his hand, his gaze lowered. No one spoke. The station doors swung open, and a group of military officers entered, carrying orders from the Pentagon. The sound of their boots struck the tile floor like the beat of a marching drum, measured, cold, absolute. The commanding officer stepped forward, holding out a document, his voice ringing clear. "By order of General Abrams, this facility is hereby placed under the temporary authority of the Department of Defense until the investigation is complete." For a moment, silence hung heavy until a young police officer blurted out, "This is a violation of our rights." The words vanished almost instantly as the soldier's gaze swept over him. Outside, townspeople gathered along the street, watching in silence as the military vehicles lined the block, their dark green armor gleaming faintly under the rising sun. A few raised their phones to record, but most just stood still quiet, aware that something larger than any single incident was unfolding before them. Rick remained where he was, breathing hard, sweat tracing down his temples. He didn't know how to respond, only that the truth had become unmistakable. The man who once gave orders now stood surrounded by those who carried the real ones. When a soldier approached and read his name aloud from a list, Rick gave a faint, bitter smile. "You think you can take this from me? This is my town," the officer replied, voice steady and unshaken. "As of this morning, it belongs to the nation." The station gates closed behind them, the heavy clang of metal echoing like the sound of an era of abused power being sealed shut. Rick was led inside, his footsteps echoing down the long hallway, mixing with the static of military radios and the rustle of papers being turned and checked. Outside, the crowd remained still. No cheers, no protests. A veteran among them murmured, "What they're seeing this morning isn't the military taking over power, it's honor returning to where it belongs." In the new morning light, the flags on the armored vehicles fluttered gently, and Havenbrook, a once quiet little town, woke beneath the cold breath of military order, where silence itself took the shape of justice being restored. Inside Havenbrook Station, the air thickened, every footstep of the soldiers striking dryly against the narrow hallways. Office doors swung open, one after another. Filing cabinets were overturned, computers sealed, each hard drive slipped into an anti-static bag and bound with red tape stamped "property of the Pentagon." On the wall, the clock struck exactly 8, its second hand sliding over the dial, without emotion, marking the moment when the town's small administrative system had officially fallen under military control. The officers moved with precision, quiet and methodical, no shouting, no accusation. That silence pressed harder on the Havenbrook police than any spoken judgment could. Collins stood by the corridor, gripping an old file tightly, watching the uniformed men pass, his eyes unfocused, unsure if what he felt was shame or relief. A team of military technicians entered the main operations room, dismantling the surveillance drives and copying the data with practiced precision. The computer screens flickered lines of code, scrolling endlessly, capturing every trace of evidence. Every camera feed, phone log, and the original report filed by Rick Talbot were uploaded to the Pentagon's secure network. When the final file was completed, an officer lifted a metal seal and stamped it hard onto the desk. The sound rang sharp and cold. "All data is now sealed." The words hung in the air, freezing the room into uneasy silence. The police officers watched, none daring to speak, each realizing that every keystroke and every word they had written was now evidence of what they had tried to hide. Rick was brought out of his office, his hands cuffed in front of him, his face pale, but his eyes still burning with fury. He looked around, seeing the rows of soldiers in uniform lining the hall, their expressions blank, detached. The feeling of being seen but not acknowledged drove him nearly mad. "I followed procedure," he shouted, his voice hoarse, echoing through the station. No one answered, only the sound of pens scratching and papers tearing from folders. He screamed again, louder. I acted within the law. I was doing my job. A military officer stepped forward, meeting his eyes calmly, and said quietly but clearly, "When procedure becomes an excuse for wrongdoing, it stops being law. It becomes guilt." The words struck him silent. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He was pushed gently toward the door, the daylight striking his face so sharply that he squinted. Outside, the crowd was utterly silent, broken only by the clicks of cameras and the synchronized footsteps of the escort team. In that moment, Rick felt the collapse of everything he had once believed he controlled. As he was guided into the armored vehicle, he looked through the glass and saw the American flag whipping in the wind above the station, saw the faces turned toward him, not angry, just cold. He tried to speak once more. "I was just following procedure," but his voice was swallowed by the sharp growl of the engine. The steel door slammed shut, the echo reverberating through the air, closing off an era when power had been used to threaten honor. Outside, the city of Havenbrook stood still, witnessing the beginning of justice. Justice that moved not with rage but with discipline. The Pentagon's data verification room lay deep underground where no light ever reached, and every sound was swallowed by thick, lead-lined walls. On the opposite wall, dozens of screens displayed synchronized footage extracted from Havenbrook Police Station's security system. The air was heavy, and no one spoke. Only the dry rhythm of keystrokes and the faint clicks of a mouse broke the silence. At the center of the room, General Abrams stood with his arms crossed, his gaze locked on the main screen. The image of Rick Talbot appeared stepping into frame beside Elijah Ward. The footage was grainy, but every detail was clear. The officer raised his taser. His expression hardened, not a single word of warning. A flash. Elijah fell, the sound of shattering glass mixing with the screams of witnesses. The entire room went still. A data officer pressed pause, freezing the image at the exact moment the current struck Elijah's body. Abrams stepped forward, his voice low. No warning, no resistance. He acted on instinct or habit. Another officer nodded. "Yes, sir. We cross-checked every report. There's no evidence Ward ever resisted." Abrams remained silent, staring at Rick's face on the screen, the eyes of a man convinced he could not be wrong. "That habit," he said, "is born from believing you stand above the law." He gestured for the video to continue. The footage rolled on, showing Rick stooping to pick up the fallen ID card, reading the words, "Colonel, U.S. Army," then tossing it aside with a smirk. That image made everyone in the room look up. In the corner, Collins sat, hunched hands clasped tightly, his eyes avoiding the screen. When the video froze again, the reflected light revealed the unease and guilt written across his face. Abrams turned toward him, his voice measured. "You were there when it happened." Collins nodded, his throat tightening. His voice cracked. "I saw it, but I didn't speak." The words filled the cold room thick and heavy. One of the clerks stopped writing, glancing toward him, while Abrams stood still, expression unreadable. "Why?" he asked. Collins looked down, trembling. "Because I was afraid. In that station, telling the truth means being cast out. We learned to stay silent, to stay safe." Abrams moved closer, his tone quiet, but carrying the weight of a man long shaped by discipline. "Safety, bought with silence, never lasts. And when justice finally comes knocking, it's you who must open the door." Collins lowered his head, his hands gripping tighter until his knuckles turned white. Abrams signaled to the technician to fast forward to the final clip. The hidden camera in the corner showed Rick writing his report, his face calm, while in the hallway Elijah was wheeled away on a stretcher. The scene ended with the door closing, a frame of deception sealed shut. Abrams looked around, his voice steady, each word echoing in the stillness. "The truth is here in every frame and every bowed head, and it will be revealed." No one spoke. The light from the screens continued to cast its glow across their faces, revealing even the things things they wished to hide. Outside, Washington remained still, but within these walls, justice had awakened not with noise or applause, but through a single, undeniable piece of footage. Abrams stood tall in the cold room, the blue light from the monitors outlining his face, tracing a faint halo around his aged but piercing eyes. Collins kept his head bowed, his shoulders trembling, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. The silence was so deep that only the hum of electricity in the outlets and the faint whir of the servers could be heard. Abrams stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the floor until it loomed behind Collins. He looked down, his voice low but resonant. Fear doesn't erase the sin of silence. It was not a rebuke nor an accusation, but it carried a weight that froze the entire room. Collins closed his eyes, exhaling slowly, the sound of regret and exhaustion woven into his breath. He knew in that moment he no longer stood on the other side of justice, but beneath it. Abrams turned back toward the officers and technicians waiting for orders. "We can't afford another mistake," he said, each word precise and measured. "Every piece of evidence, every file, every image must be transmitted immediately. No edits, no delays, no compromises." The record keeper quickly rose, holding a thick file stamped with a red seal. Abrams flipped through the pages, his gaze landing on the final line of the investigation summary. "Action motivated by racial bias." The words were bold, straight, and unambiguous, a verdict already written. He closed the file, tapped its cover against the table to steady it, his voice dropping. "That line stays as it is. No softer wording. No one blurs the truth of guilt." A young communications officer lifted an encrypted phone, entering the security sequence before confirming a direct link to the Department of Justice. When he pressed send, the red indicator light turned green, signaling full transmission. The room seemed to exhale all at once, but Abrams didn't look away from the monitor where the words appeared: "Data transfer complete." He stared at it as if seeing the long chain of consequences waiting ahead, not just for Rick Talbot, for the entire system that had turned silence into a habit. He turned to Collins, who still sat motionless, and his voice softened, though it retained its authority. "You were afraid, but at least today you spoke. Sometimes redemption doesn't come from an apology, it comes from action." Collins looked up, eyes glistening, and nodded slightly, his lips moving, but no sound escaped. Abrams paused at the doorway for a brief moment before leaving. He turned back to the room bathed in blue light, where the monitors still replayed the footage of Elijah Ward being struck by the taser, the flash, then the darkness. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. "Justice never needs to hurry, but once it arrives, nothing can stop it." Then he stepped out at the steel door, closing behind him with a resonant clang. On the table, the thick file lay sealed, stamped in bold red Department of Justice, official evidence file. In the lower right corner, a smaller line stood out cold and final action, but motivated by racial bias. And on that quiet morning, America began to turn a new page, one where truth, though delayed, still had the right to be heard. Morning in Washington began with cold winds sweeping across the square where dozens of reporters had gathered early. In front of the defense building, every camera pointed toward the same door where an emergency meeting was about to take place with representatives from the Pentagon, the Department of Justice, and senior military officers. Inside, the long conference room was lined with dark wooden tables covered in documents, steaming coffee cups, and files marked with red labels. General Abrams entered first, walking upright, his expression stern, followed by a group of officers and a man in a dark suit, Elijah Ward. The air felt compressed with tension. The overhead lights reflected off the polished table, filling the room with a harsh, sterile brightness. As the door closed, the sound of cameras outside ceased, giving way to a silence that felt like the moment before a verdict. Abrams stood at the head of the table, his voice steady and commanding. "Honor has no color." The sentence made everyone in the room lift their heads. He paused briefly, glancing around until his gaze met that of the Justice Department representative taking notes, then continued. "If we allow prejudice to touch the uniform, we've let the weakest part of ourselves win. And when honor is twisted by power, it stops being a symbol, it becomes guilt." His tone was calm, deliberate, but carried a weight that made the room resonate with quiet agreement. Elijah sat beside him, his hand resting on the file before him, neither clenched nor trembling, held with the composure of a man long accustomed to making decisions in silence. The moderator invited him to speak. Elijah rose the chair, scraping softly against the floor, the light catching his face and tracing every line of age and experience. He looked around, seeing unfamiliar faces, some lowered in respect, others watching him as though he were a temporary embodiment of justice. His voice was deep, slow, and each word deliberate. "I don't want their apologies. I want them to understand that humiliation doesn't require a weapon, only silence." The room fell still. Abrams turned toward him, his eyes filled with both admiration and sorrow. A few note-takers paused their pens, suspended midair, afraid that even a sound might disturb the gravity of what had just been said. Elijah continued, his tone soft but edged with steel. "A soldier can endure wounds, but this country cannot endure another fracture born of silence from those sworn to defend it." He stopped, his gaze shifting toward the media representatives recording the session, then said, "We can draft more laws, write more reports, but nothing will change if fear still triumphs in the hearts of those who wear the uniform." When he sat down, no one applauded. The silence that followed carried more weight than any applause could have, because it did not come from indifference, but from understanding. Outside the conference room, the press waited. When the doors opened and light flooded in, Elijah stepped out into a forest of cameras. He said nothing more, only nodded when a reporter asked, "Do you believe justice is returning?" He replied, "It never left. We just forgot how to see it." Those words spread through countless broadcasts, and that morning in Washington no longer felt cold. Within an hour, Elijah Ward's words appeared on the front pages of nearly every major newspaper. "Humiliation needs no weapon, only silence," became the most shared quote of the day, appearing everywhere, from political coverage to social media feeds. Thousands reposted it beneath discussions about justice, honor, and the silent society had tolerated for too long. In classrooms, teachers used it as an example in discussions about moral duty. Radio stations replayed the interview, his calm, steady voice echoing through speakers, cutting deep into the public consciousness. "I don't want their apologies. I want them to understand." People repeated it not because it was a rallying cry, but because it was a mirror one that forced everyone who heard it to see themselves within. Beyond Washington, peaceful demonstrations began across several states. People carried signs with that same quote, shouting, "Nothing clashing with no one." They simply lit candles and stood still outside local police departments. Their silence became the loudest voice, a reflection of the very truth Elijah had once implied. On evening broadcasts, anchors looked directly into the camera, reciting their words before pausing for several seconds, letting the audience feel their full weight. Amid the restless rhythm of the Capitol, that sentence became a thread pulling people back to an idea they had long forgotten, that honor is not a reward but a responsibility. At the Pentagon, General Abrams received the final report from the investigative team. He sat in his office, a file before him detailing every violation, every piece of evidence, every statement. The light through the window cast faint shadows across his face, his eyes hollow from sleepless night. He read every line, then lowered his pen to sign the document titled "Emergency Dismissal Order for Involved Personnel." His signature was sharp and deliberate, showing no hesitation. When the pen lifted from the page, he said quietly, "It's time for honor to return to where it belongs." The words weren't meant for anyone yet. The secretary standing nearby heard them, clearly nodded once, and carried the file away. The statement was released at noon. In the press room, the Defense Department spokesperson read slowly each word echoing before dozens of cameras. Following an internal investigation confirmed by the Department of Justice, the Pentagon orders the dismissal of the entire command of the Havenbrook Police Department and all individuals involved in conduct that violated the honor of the armed forces. This is not merely a disciplinary action, but a declaration of principle. National honor has no exceptions. The final sentence left the entire room in silence. Outside, newsrooms across the country published the update simultaneously. Bold headlines flooding every feed. Justice begins with those who dare to face it. And amid the flow of breaking news, Elijah's words remained at the center, a reminder that sometimes a single sentence can shake an entire system, not through power, but through truth. The Havenbrook City Hall was packed. In the front rows sat reporters, cameras, and nameplates gleaming under the lights. That morning, the live broadcast aired nationwide with millions watching to witness the conclusion of the case that had shaken America for weeks. On the defendant's bench, Rick Talbot sat upright, his shirt collar neatly adjusted, his face, rigid eyes, distant as if he were still the one giving orders, not the man awaiting judgment. Beside him, his lawyer exhaled softly, while behind them the people of Havenbrook sat silent in the thick air of anticipation. When the elderly judge struck the gavel, the sound spread like the toll of fate. Defendant Rick Talbot. The judge's voice was steady. This court finds you guilty of assaulting a senior military officer while on active duty in violation of Title 18 of the Federal Code. The words fell heavy, echoing through the minds of everyone present. Rick remained still, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed forward. There was no trace of fear, no hint of remorse. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every small movement, the slow swallow, the dry twitch of his lips. A reporter stood suddenly and called out, "Do you feel any remorse, Officer Talbot?" Rick lifted his head, his mouth tightening into a faint smile. "No," he replied, his voice low and clear. "I just dared to do what everyone else was thinking." The hall fell silent after that, a silence so sharp carried the faint tapping of the judge's pen against the wooden bench. A few reporters looked up, eyes wide, stunned that the man before them still bore the same defiant arrogance from the day of the video. Among the audience, some sighed, others shook their heads, hands clasped tightly in unease. Rick sat motionless, indifferent, as though the verdict belonged to someone else. In that moment, his image ceased to be that of a single corrupt officer. It became the naked symbol of a deeper decay. The warped belief that the law exists to serve power, not justice. From the front row, Elijah Ward watched quietly, his eyes not angry, only sorrowful. When he heard Rick's words, he tilted his head slightly and murmured, "And that is why justice must be different." The whisper was meant for no one, yet somehow it rippled across the room. A reporter nearby caught it and jotted it down, and within hours Elijah's words appeared in headlines as a cold, measured response to Rick's defiance. On the bench, the judge resumed, reading, his tone grave. "The court hereby orders the revocation of rank, termination of service, and a sentence of 10 years imprisonment." Each word carried the sound of a system stitching close the wound it had finally chosen to confront. As Rick was led out, the cameras kept following him. His face was gaunt, yet the mocking smile remained, though no one wished to see it anymore. Outside, the crowd stood in silence, the morning wind rustling through the trees, scattering a few leaves across the courthouse steps. Elijah was the last to emerge, his pace slow, head slightly bowed. He looked up at the silver-gray sky over Havenbrook, his low voice carried on the breath of cold air. Sometimes, for justice to be heard, one must pay with their own silence. And in that moment the trial ended, but its echo did not. Rick Talbot's answer had barely faded when the air in the courtroom seemed to drain away. The light from dozens of overhead bulbs poured onto the judge's bench, making the room glaringly bright, yet it could not chase away the chill in the eyes that followed him. The judge leaned toward the microphone, about to close the proceedings, but Elijah Ward had already risen. He walked forward slowly, one hand resting lightly on the wooden table, the light catching his glasses and casting a sharp glint like a blade. The entire courtroom held its breath. He looked straight at Rick, his voice deep, steady, each word falling like the strike of a hammer. And that, he said, is why justice must dare to be different. A few people in the courtroom looked up as if the words weren't meant just for the man at the stand, but for everyone present. Rick turned toward him, the mockery in his eyes fading into something unsteady and confused. Elijah said nothing more. He straightened his gaze, calm, his voice softening. If justice only repeats the mistakes of men, then it no longer deserves its name. All sound vanished. No camera, shutters, no whispers. In that silence, it seemed everyone could hear the slow drag of the judge's pen signing the verdict, the scratch of ink across paper echoing like the sound of a destiny already written. The camera lights panned slowly toward Elijah, who stood still, not with the pride of victory, but with the quiet gravity of a witness to something greater than himself. From the audience, a young reporter looked up, her eyes wet. She understood that some words are not written into history, yet someday they become its markers. A few in the hall lowered their heads, some wiped their eyes, others simply stared at their own hands, the same hands that had once applauded authority without realizing they were helping to distort justice. The courtroom was utterly silent, no applause breaking the stillness. That silence was not the sound of victory, but another kind of punishment, the punishment of conscience, forced to confront the echo of what is right. Elijah walked back to his seat, his pace slow but steady, his shoulders straight, his face more solemn than before, as if he understood that he had not just closed a trial, but opened a longer battle, one between humanity and its own limits. The judge raised his head and struck the gavel one final time. Court adjourned. The cold, sharp sound dissolved into the air, yet its echo lingered, threading through the minds of all present. As people rose, no one spoke, no one congratulated anyone. The footsteps leaving the hall were heavy, not with fear, but with the quiet unease of conscience, that subtle weight that comes when one realizes that justice, to truly exist, sometimes must be rewritten from their own silence. A week after the trial, America once again stopped before the weight of cold numbers. The national report on police violence was released on Monday morning before the media, federals, officials, and millions watching on television. On the large screen in the briefing room, the numbers appeared stark and undeniable, needing no commentary. 47% of police-related violent incidents in the past year targeted people of color. The spokesperson's voice was steady, but each word cut through the air like a blade. No one spoke. The cameras panned slowly, capturing the tense faces of officials, some looking down, others struggling to remain composed. The report continued listing cases, and among them was one line, the Elijah Ward incident, Havenbrook. The sound of pages turning broke the silence, sharp and cold. In the corner of the room, Elijah Ward sat quietly. He had been invited as the central figure, the man who had forced an entire system to confront itself. Beside him sat a small black box, the Medal of Honor the Department of Defense intended to award him, a symbol of restored dignity. When it was his turn to speak, Elijah rose tall and lean, the light glinting off his shoulder, illuminating the faded patch on his old uniform. He looked around, not at anyone in particular, but beyond the room itself, toward the people he believed were the true victims of silence. His voice came low, clear, each word deliberate. I am grateful for this recognition, but I will not accept the medal. A murmur rippled through the room, a few reporters lifting their heads ready to record every word. Elijah rested his hand on the box, his tone firm. Justice doesn't need ceremony, it needs courage. The room froze, every keyboard stilled. He continued, we can hold hundreds of ceremonies, sign thousands of reports, but if no one dares to act when they see what's wrong, justice remains nothing more than a symbol on paper. The light caught his face fully, then his eyes steady and deep, like a mirror reflecting everything society had avoided seeing. When he finished, the room stayed silent. A few people stood not to applaud, but in quiet respect. General Abrams, seated in the front row, nodded slightly, his gaze toward Elijah, no longer that of a superior to a soldier, but of a man acknowledging someone who had made the system bow. A reporter asked softly, "Sir, what do you think will change?" Elijah turned, a faint smile crossing his face. "The only thing that can, when people begin to fear silence more than confrontation." The session ended, the report was signed, and the numbers remained 47%, 32%, 18%, the ratios of a truth that could no longer be buried. Elijah stepped out of the hall sunlight slanting across the pavement, carrying with him the unopened metal case, leaving behind a room full of people who had just realized that justice might not begin with speeches, but with the moment one dares to face themselves. General Abrams stood in the front row, his hands clasped before him, eyes following Elijah Ward as he stepped down from the podium. The man's words still echoed in everyone's minds like a melody without rhythm, but with a resonance that refused to fade. Justice doesn't need ceremony. It needs courage. No one applauded because there are moments that cannot be answered with noise. Abrams drew a deep breath. His shoulders trembled slightly, yet his face remained composed. Those who watched saw him nod, a slow, firm, deliberate nod, not of praise, but of quiet acknowledgement. In that nod was pride, sorrow, and the heavy weight he had carried through years of service. The belief that sometimes ordinary people do what entire systems forget they are meant to do. Elijah paused at the doorway, turning back, as light from the large window behind him formed a pale halo around his figure. In that instant, their eyes met. One man had spent a lifetime in uniform, witnessing wars beyond borders, now realizing that the greatest battle was within his own country. The other, bearing the scars of justice, stood in the place where it was being restored, not through power, but through courage. No words were spoken yet between them, stretched an invisible thread, one that could exist only between those who understood the true meaning of honor. A breeze drifted through the open window, stirring the white curtain, filling the room with the faint scent of coffee and the click of cameras. Abrams stepped closer, stopping by the window where the American flag waved outside, its red and white merging with the blue of the sky. Elijah joined him, the two men standing side by side, not looking at each other, but both fixing their eyes on the flag fluttering gently in the wind. They didn't need to speak, for both understood what was present, not pride, but the quiet sense of a nation learning how to make things right again. Down on the street, the crowd still waited. A few newspapers lifted high the morning's image of Elijah during the hearing printed across their front pages. Abrams spoke softly, his voice deep and steady like the wind itself. "You reminded them why we wear the uniform." Elijah replied, his tone gentle, "And you reminded them that honor isn't meant for display." The two men, one old, one younger, stood still in that quiet Washington afternoon. The American flag before them continued to wave its slow rhythm, catching the slanted sunlight. That image, simple yet sacred, seemed to embody justice itself. After long days of silence, finding its form once more in the stance of two men who refused to bow before wrongdoing, and in the glimmering reflection across the stripes billowing in the wind. The morning in Havenbrook was gentle sunlight slanting through the small window of the elementary school at the end of the street where the freshly watered plants still held shimmering drops of dew. On the board, the teacher wrote in large letters, "Justice and Courage," the topic of today's discussion. The students sat upright, wide eyes following her every movement, filled with that pure curiosity adults rarely keep. In the corner of the board was a newspaper clipping showing Elijah Ward at the press conference in Washington. Beside the bold caption, "Justice doesn't need ceremony, it needs courage. The teacher pointed to it, her voice soft as a breeze. This is the man the whole country is talking about, someone who reminded us that honor isn't something given by others, but something we keep through our actions. In the corner of the classroom, a boy named Leo raised his hand, his eyes both timid and determined. "Teacher," he asked, his small voice carrying clearly through the quiet room, if he wasn't a colonel, would anyone have saved him? The question silenced the class. The children turned their puzzled faces toward the teacher waiting. She stood still for a few seconds, lips parted, but no words came. Sunlight fell across her face, revealing a mix of confusion and sorrow. Outside, the sound of passing cars drifted in steadily, as if the world remained calm, while inside this room, one question had made the air heavier. She walked slowly back to her desk, set the chalk down, and took a deep breath. Her voice came out rough but warm. "Leo, that's the question of an entire nation." The class remained silent. She looked at Elijah's photo on the board, then turned back. Maybe what hurts people the most isn't that he was attacked, but that everyone knows if he hadn't worn that uniform, maybe no one would remember his name today. A girl in the front row lowered her head. Small hands clasped tightly, while a few other children exchanged glances, their eyes reflecting something that they couldn't yet name. The teacher continued, "But your question is important because it reminds adults that justice can't only appear when someone has a title. It must exist even when all a person has left is the truth." She paused, looking toward the back row, where sunlight stretched across open notebooks glinting off the pages. "Someday," she said, "you'll all grow up and maybe you won't remember Mr. Ward, but I hope you'll remember the question Leo just asked, because it's what keeps us from ever falling asleep again." Her words spread softly through the room, touching something deep within the children. Outside, the wind brushed gently past the window, leaves drifted slowly across the schoolyard, and the laughter of students from the next classroom mingled with the quiet rhythm of a city slowly learning how to heal. In that light, Havenbrook seemed brighter than usual. Leo's question still lingered in the air without an absolute answer, but it had already begun its own journey. A journey that made adults look inward, that made a nation ask itself what it had traded away for justice to sometimes wait until someone's rank was high enough to be recognized. Leo's question didn't stay inside the small classroom in Havenbrook. A week later, an article titled, "If He Weren't a Colonel, Would Anyone Have Saved Him?" appeared on the front page of the Washington Journal. The headline was simple, but its weight made readers pause in the middle of their busy morning. The author, a journalist who had been present during that class, wrote with sincerity about the teacher's silence about the children's eyes as they faced a question without an answer. "Sometimes truth isn't taught through lessons, but through a question that makes people ashamed of their silence," the article concluded. From that day, Leo's question was echoed everywhere, from congressional hearings to educational forum. The media began calling it the Havenbrook question, a phrase used to remind people of social responsibility and moral conscience. Schools across the country organized discussions on the topic, encouraging students to talk about justice, equality, and the things that should have been self-evident but had long been forgotten. A national television network launched a program titled "Who Will Speak Up?" inspired by that question, inviting influential figures to debate the moral limits of power. Each broadcast began with the words scrolling across the screen, "If he weren't a colonel, would anyone have saved him?" The host read the line slowly, as if afraid that saying it too fast would diminish the truth contained in each word. In Havenbrook, where the question was born, a small plaque was placed at the elementary school gate engraved with Leo's exact word. Every morning, students passed by reading it and smiling, most of them still too young to grasp its full meaning. But the adults understood. The question was not only for Elijah Ward, but for everyone who had ever stood before wrongdoing and chosen to look away. It became a lesson in citizenship, included in school materials across several states, the line printed in bold at the top of the page, a reminder that a society is only truly free when courage is not limited by color or rank. In a small house on the outskirts of Washington, Elijah Ward sat alone alone by the window. The newspaper spread open before him. The headline was printed in bold across the front page, just beneath the photograph of an ordinary classroom he had never visited. He read the line again and again, his finger pausing over the question before letting go. The last light of day streamed through the window, tracing faint shadows across his face. He sat in silence for a long time, neither speaking nor writing. In that moment, he felt that the child's question was not only for society, but also for himself. A man who had been saved, yet knew that many others had never been given that chance. A soft breeze passed through, rustling the newspaper. The words still there, simple yet haunting. If he weren't a colonel, would anyone have saved him? And Elijah understood that justice does not end when it is carried out, but when it compels people to look inward, so they do not repeat the same mistakes again. On a quiet morning in the Virginia suburbs, an elderly woman with silver hair sat by the window holding an old pen she had kept since her days in the military. The first light of day streamed through lace curtains, casting a thin beam across the table, where a blank sheet of paper lay neatly beside a cup of tea gone cold. She wrote slowly, each line precise yet heavy with meaning. My dear, I once carried a gun onto the battlefield. I learned what fear was, and I also learned how not to let fear dictate my actions. I was never afraid of the enemy. What I feared most, she wrote, was losing my compassion. The pen paused briefly, then continued across the page, the ink deepening. Never let a badge make you forget the eyes of another human being. She was a veteran who had served with the medical relief unit in Iraq, a woman who had saved many soldiers and seen the despair in the eyes of innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. Now, her son was a police officer, a young and passionate man who had begun to change, becoming colder, more distant with each passing year. Her handwriting grew heavier, more deliberate. Whether soldier or officer, both wear the promise to serve, she wrote. But remember, the badge doesn't make a person noble. It only reminds us that we can be wrong, and that it takes courage to admit it. Outside, a breeze turned the edge of the page, carrying in the scent of pine from the trees out front, fell in the room with memories. That night, she mailed the letter, never imagining that a few days later it would spread across the country after a fellow veteran read it and posted it online. Within hours, tens of thousands of shares appeared, comments pouring in without pause. Many wrote that they cried when they reached the line. The eyes of another human being are the one thing you must never forget. Journalists began calling her the mother of America's conscience. The letter circulated so widely that national newspapers reprinted it in full. In police stations across the country, young officers printed copies and pinned them to bulletin boards, some even reading them aloud during internal briefings. A week later, during a Senate hearing on police reform, a senator stood up and unfolded a creased sheet of paper from his jacket pocket. "I hadn't planned to speak today," he said, "but I'd like to read a few words from a mother, a woman who once wore the uniform and now has a son who does." The chamber fell silent as he read clearly, his voice steady. "Never let a badge make you forget the eyes of another human being." When he finished, the room erupted in applause, not for the speaker, but for the unknown mother who had spoken the truth that millions had been waiting to hear. That night, national television replayed the moment from the Senate floor. In her small house, the mother sat beside a freshly poured cup of tea, the screen reflecting the image of her letter against the backdrop of the American flag waving gently behind the podium. She smiled, her eyes soft yet bright, and whispered like a prayer. "If one sentence of mine makes someone stop before pulling the trigger, that's enough." And somewhere in the city of Havenbrook, among oath plaques and patrol lights, a few young officers did stop, looked into the mirror, and saw again the eyes they had forgotten. Rick Talbot sat in his small cell, the light from the wall-mounted television casting faint shadows across his gaunt face, reflecting every slow flicker of the evening news. The anchor's calm voice recounted the story of the veteran mother's letter, how it had been read in the Senate and sparked a nationwide awakening of compassion. On the screen, the American flag waved behind the senator, and the words, "Never let let a badge make you forget the eyes of another human being," appeared in clear, bold letters. Rick stared at it, his hands clasped tightly, his thumb rubbing unconsciously over an old callus. His eyes were dry, but something inside him stirred a feeling he couldn't name, sharp yet silent. He exhaled slowly, leaning his head back against the wall surrounded by the scent of old paint and damp concrete, though the real suffocation came from the stillness within himself. He remembered the moment on the witness stand when he had said he only dared to do what everyone was thinking. Now, within these four walls, that sentence echoed back at him like cruel irony. What he had once believed to be strength was nothing more than fear. Fear of losing control, fear of appearing weak, fear of facing his own humanity. Rick lifted his head and looked again at the screen where the image of the elderly veteran mother reappeared, her silver hair framing gentle, steady eyes. She was saying honor doesn't rest on a badge, but in how we treat others. The words caught in his throat, his eyes burning. He tried to swallow, but tears fell anyway, hot and heavy. Then he laughed softly, almost in despair. "The whole country's learning what I forgot," he whispered, his voice breaking into the hollow quiet of the room. Outside, rain fell steadily against the bars, the light from the corridor streaming through and casting trembling white streaks across the wall. Rick closed his eyes, and in his mind appeared the face of Elijah Ward, the man he had once humiliated. He pictured those eyes calm yet profound, neither angry nor forgiving, only reflecting back what was left inside him. For the first time since his arrest, Rick felt fear, but not the fear of prison. He was afraid of dying before finding the part of himself he had lost. Elsewhere, in a small house on the outskirts of Washington, Elijah Ward sat at a table, turning the pages of a newspaper covering the veteran mother's letter. When he reached the part describing how it had made Congress rise to its feet, he smiled a faint, quiet smile. Someone had asked if he felt any satisfaction knowing that those who had wronged him were now facing consequences. Elijah simply looked down at his cold cup of tea, his voice low and steady. "Justice isn't revenge. It's how people rediscover the truth they tried to forget." He glanced outside where the rain was falling, each drop tapping against the stone patio in slow, rhythmic time. Elijah knew there were no victors in this story, because in every judgment, the most frightening thing is not the sentence itself, but the moment when people forget how to look at one another with human eyes. The afternoon in Havenbrook was tinted with a pale gold sunlight slanting through rows of bare trees, casting faint thread-like streaks across the road. The wind carried the scent of an old season mingled with something both familiar and heavy. Elijah Ward drove his old car back to the street he once swore he would never see again. The convenience store still stood there, small and quiet, not much different from the day he was thrown to the floor. The sign was older, the paint faded, but the glass door still bore the long scratch where the electric spark had flashed. He stopped at the entrance, stepped out, letting the evening wind sweep across his shoulders, his eyes fixed on the familiar space that time had not managed to erase. Inside, Maria stood behind the counter, her hair longer now, her eyes still cautious but deeper, as if what had happened years ago had left behind a lasting stillness within her. When the bell above the door rang, she looked up and recognized him, her hands freezing midair. For a moment, the entire room seemed to stop breathing, the light glinting off the countertop where Elijah had once fallen. He walked closer, unhurried, placing his hand gently on the counter where a small burn mark still lingered, faded by time but still visible. "I thought they would have replaced this counter by now," he said softly but clearly. Maria replied in a low voice, "I didn't let them." Elijah reached into his coat pocket and took out a small object, an old military badge, its brass edge worn thin with age. He placed it on the counter beside the burn mark, his hand resting there for a few seconds before pulling away. "Don't scrub out that burn," he said, his gaze drifting toward the sunlight filtering through the window. "Let it stay as a reminder that some mistakes shouldn't be erased, but seen, so they aren't repeated." Maria looked at him, emotion rising in her eyes, a mix of reverence and remorse. She stepped closer, her voice trembling yet firm. "I never forgot." Elijah smiled a quiet but deep smile. His eyes wandered across the room, new shelves, a small photo on the wall showing the old newspaper clipping with his picture, and the headline, "Who Protects the Protector?" He said nothing more, only stood still as if allowing memory to blend once more with the present. Outside, the wind stirred the door chime, the sound echoing exactly as it had the day everything began, but this time it carried no fear, only the calm of a man who had finally reached the end of his long journey. Before leaving, Elijah turned back and looked at Maria one last time, his eyes warm yet distant. "Thank you for not forgetting," he said, then opened the door and stepped out. The evening breeze swept through, carrying dry leaves across the ground. The badge on the counter caught the last rays of sunlight reflecting off the old burn mark. Two fragments of time existing side by side, one of the past, one of redemption. Maria stood still watching his silhouette fade at the end of the street, her eyes touched by the golden glow of dusk, the light of memory, of forgiveness, and of something she knew Havenbrook would never stop remembering. Behind the counter on the wall, once stained by an old burn mark, a new wooden plaque had been hung. It was small, simple, painted a deep brown with white hand-carved letters standing out clearly against the surface. "Respect begins here." Maria had hung it herself right at the spot where Elijah had fallen years ago, where everything that once seemed broken had begun to turn into a symbol of change. The last light of day fell across the words, making them glow softly but firmly. Elijah looked at the plaque for a long time, his lips curving into a faint smile that carried both peace and remembrance. He understood that Maria hadn't hung it as a memorial, but as a reminder to everyone who walked through that door that justice doesn't always begin in a courtroom, but in the way people see one another, in the choice between silence and courage. Maria stepped forward, gently wiping the counter, her hands trembling with emotion. She spoke softly. "I've thought about it for years, Colonel. There are things we can't change, but we can keep them so we don't forget." Elijah nodded, his gaze resting on the words above them. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. "Everything good begins with respect." His voice was soft, but each word seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime that had seen loss and found faith again in humanity. They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the distant sound of cars fading down the street, the gentle ticking of a clock behind the counter, marking the slow passage of a late afternoon filled with meaning. Elijah looked around the small shop. It seemed smaller than he remembered. The shelves were new. A small photo of him and Maria sat on the corner of the counter, in a simple wooden frame, the calm in their eyes in that picture, something he once thought he'd lost. Beside it lay a notebook filled with handwritten notes from visitors, strangers from across the country who had come to Havenbrook after reading about what happened. One wrote, "I came here to see the place where justice was touched." Another had written, "Thank you for keeping the burn mark so we remember that mistakes can also bring light." Elijah touched the page lightly, feeling his fingers tremble as if he were turning over a fragment of the past. The glass door behind him opened, and the afternoon wind drifted in, carrying the faint scent of pine from the street outside. He took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs with an unfamiliar sense of ease. Maria looked at him, her eyes warm. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked. Elijah was silent for a few seconds before answering quietly, "No one ever ends what's right. People just learn to carry it on in another way." The words made Maria lower her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. Not tears of guilt, but of relief, of gratitude. Outside, the fading sunlight stretched across the street, glinting off the plaque's white letters through the shop window. "Respect begins here." The words shimmered faintly against the wood, and in that moment Havenbrook seemed to exhale a town once defined by silence, now held together by remembrance, forgiveness, and the quiet strength of those who chose not to forget. Elijah pushed the glass door open, the small bell above it chiming a familiar sound like a greeting from the past. Outside, the last light of day stretched across the old street, the rain-damp pavement glimmering glimmering as if streaked with silver. He turned once more, looking back at the plaque behind the counter, the words, "Respect begins here," reflected through the glass and cast faintly across his sleeve. Inside, Maria watched him go, her hands gripping the edge of the counter, her eyes filled with both affection and quiet admiration. Elijah walked slowly down the street, the sound of his shoes tapping against the worn brick blending with the evening wind, the edge of his coat catching the golden hue of sunset. Along that road he carried no medals, no sense of triumph, only the one truth left after everything, that people can still change, that respect can begin in the smallest of places, like the old burn mark still resting on that counter, like the light falling across his sleeve, lingering for a moment before fading into the dusk. That morning, sunlight streamed through the small window of Elijah Ward's modest study. A worn wooden desk, a steaming cup of tea, and a stack of books by the wall. Everything in the room carried the quiet simplicity of a man who had chosen to live far from the noise of recognition. The sound of a delivery truck stopping outside the gate broke his train of thought. A white envelope was left by the door, its corner marked with the seal of the Pentagon. Elijah opened it, his hands trembling slightly, feeling again the familiar weight of official papers, but this time it wasn't an order or a field report. It was something different, a message, an acknowledgement. The paper was thick, the ink crisp, each line neatly typed, and beneath it the signature of General Jonathan Abrams. Elijah. The first line read, "I am not writing to you as a commander, but as a man who owes you gratitude." He read slowly, each word carrying the weight of years gone by. "You made justice more than a slogan. You turned it back into something people could see, touch, and believe in. While others tried to prove the law's strength, you reminded them that true strength lies in courage and compassion. For that, this nation is in your debt." Elijah sat in silence for a long time, the paper trembling lightly in his hand as the morning light passed through the window, illuminating each line until it seemed to glow. He read it again, stopping at the final sentence. "We once fought for peace, but perhaps the real battle is to make people believe in it again. You have done that through your calm and your integrity." Beneath it, Abrams's signature remained firm, but drawn slightly longer, as though he had paused before finishing it. Elijah took a deep breath, folded the letter carefully, placed it back into the envelope, and looked out into the still air where sunlight drifted softly through the dust. He smiled, a gentle smile, not of pride, but of peace. Abrams's words made him think of the faces that had crossed his path. Maria Darius, the people of Havenbrook who had stood in candlelight before the police station, and the boy named Leo, whose question had made a nation pause. All those fragments, he realized, did not belong to him alone, but to something larger, what Abrams had called a visible faith. Elijah spoke softly, as if replying to the letter, "Justice has never belonged to one person. It lives in how each of us chooses to act." He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the small garden where lavender swayed gently in the wind. The white envelope still lay on the desk, its Pentagon seal glowing faintly gold under the morning light. He folded the letter again, placed it in a drawer, and rested his hand on top of it as if keeping a quiet promise. The sunlight slid along his fingers, casting a thin beam across the wood, and Elijah closed his eyes, letting the peace of the morning settle over him, a peace he knew had been paid for with pain, yet was worth preserving. Outside the window, the church bells rang in steady rhythm, their sound drifting softly across the small courtyard, brushing against the old glass panes and echoing back like the voice of memory. Elijah Ward stood by the window, the late morning light resting on his shoulders, forming a thin, glowing outline. The world outside was calm. The trees swayed gently in the wind. A few children rode past on their bicycles, their laughter ringing bright and clear through the narrow street. The sound of life, ordinary yet precious, settled something quiet within him. He listened to the lingering chime, its resonance weaving into the air, each toll a reminder of things long past but never gone, of loss of choices and of the silence belonging to a man who had once witnessed the price of justice. On the desk, The letter from the Pentagon still lay neatly in its white envelope, the seal fading under the sunlight. Elijah rested his hand over it, as if trying to feel the heartbeat of the words inside. For a moment, he thought of Abrams, of the conversation they'd once had, back when the war had not yet ended, when people still believed that discipline was the only measure of honor. Now, with everything behind him, he understood that true victories were not measured by flags, medals, or official statements, but by the way a person faced both fear and compassion. Outside, the bells kept ringing, the breeze carrying the scent of lavender and damp grass, and he closed his eyes, letting his thoughts drift as the sounds blended into a wordless symphony of memory. Elijah spoke softly, his voice low, almost as if to himself. There are battles without guns, but they still demand courage. The words slipped out like a breath, yet carried enough weight to fill the room, crossing the open window and mingling with the fading echoes of the bells. He knew this was the battle between humanity and indifference, between empathy and fear, between remaining silent and daring to speak when something is wrong. He had spent a lifetime facing visible enemies, but only now did he realize that the hardest battle was the one within, where the line between right and wrong fades and only the choice between knowing and daring remains. He turned back toward the desk, his eyes resting on an old photograph beside a stack of books. In it, he and his comrades stood together under a bright blue sky, their faces strong, yet each gaze carrying the quiet exhaustion only those who have seen war can know. He brushed his fingers gently across the frame and whispered, "Perhaps courage isn't about who we fight against, but about keeping our humanity in a world that keeps losing it." The words dripped into the light, soft as a prayer, a wish for the goodness still waiting to be restored. The church bells faded, giving way to the soft chirping of sparrows perched along the fence. Elijah stepped out onto the porch, his hand brushing the railing as sunlight touched his face, tracing the deep lines carved by the years. In the distance, people were putting up a new sign in front of the school engraved with the words of young Leo. If he hadn't been a colonel, would anyone have saved him a reminder for the generations to come? Elijah watched the scene and smiled, his eyes reflecting a rare kind of calm. The wind stirred gently, lifting the edge of his coat, and in that light he seemed to merge with the morning itself, quiet yet steadfast, a living echo of his own belief that battles without guns still continue, and that sometimes courage is the only way for humanity to keep its soul in a wounded world. A year had passed since the Havenbrook incident came to a close, and autumn had returned with its clear blue skies and golden canopies of trees. The city's central square was packed with people, small flags fluttering in their hands, the wind carrying laughter music and a sense of peace that everyone seemed to cherish. On each person's chest was a small silver pin, neatly engraved with the words, "He was tased." We awoke. The phrase was simple, yet heavier than any speech. It was no longer just a symbol of an event, but a reminder of a nation's awakening, of the capacity for change, born from a moment of pain. Amid the crowd, a gray-haired man walked slowly. Elijah Ward moved among them, wearing a light coat, blending in like any passerby. No one recognized him, and it seemed he preferred it that way. With each step across the polished stone, he saw young faces, bright eyes, small hands pinning badges onto each other's shirts with the care of people passing on something sacred. He smiled a quiet smile of someone who knew he no longer belonged to the center of attention, but to something greater, a collective memory. On the stage, a voice spoke steadily through the loudspeakers. "We do not honor the pain, but the lesson it left behind." Applause followed, scattered but sincere. Elijah stopped at the edge of the square, the afternoon light washing over his shoulders, the wind brushing past, making a badge on a nearby person's chest gleam like a reflection of the look in his own eyes years ago. A boy about 10 approached, holding a flyer printed with a flag and the event's slogan. He looked up at Elijah, his bright eyes full of curiosity. "Mister," he asked, "were you scared when people did wrong and you had to stand still?" Elijah looked at him, his expression softening. The question carried the same weight as Leo's once had, but this time it wasn't doubt. It was a longing to understand. He bent down slightly, his voice calm and deep. I was scared. Everyone is. But what makes people different is what they do while they're still afraid. The boy stayed quiet, pressing his lips together before nodding as if he had just heard something he would remember for the rest of his life. Elijah rested a hand on the boy's shoulder and added gently, "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing what's right, no matter how much you fear." The boy smiled, his eyes bright, then ran off to join the cheering crowd. Elijah stood still watching him go, the wind catching the badges and making them shimmer like thousands of tiny stars in the afternoon light. In the distance, the church bells rang again, blending with the joyful sounds of a city moving forward. He looked around, realizing that the people wearing those badges weren't commemorating him, but reminding themselves that they had awakened, that they understood justice did not live in courtrooms, but in the hearts of men. As the last light of day fell across his face, Elijah smiled faintly. In his slow steps through the crowd, he seemed a part of the very story he had once helped write, a man who walked quietly through history, leaving behind not scars but faith. Faith that courage can begin in fear, and that once justice awakens, it never truly sleeps again. Elijah leaned down, his eyes meeting the boy's innocent gaze as he waited for an answer. The wind swept across the wide square, carrying with it the echoes of footsteps, laughter, and the steady rhythm of a day of remembrance that had become tradition. He stood silent for a few seconds, letting the sounds pass, then answered softly, "Yes, I was afraid, and I still am." The boy's eyes widened, surprised that someone like him could say such a thing. Elijah smiled, his tone slow but firm. "But sometimes fear is proof of conscience." The words fell into the air as gently as the breeze, yet they seemed to quiet everything around them. A man nearby, holding a small badge in his hand, paused, his gaze slowly turning toward Elijah. A few others followed, as if realizing they had just heard something far more important than the ceremony itself. Elijah straightened, looking toward the distant flags rippling in the sunlight. He continued, his voice lower. "Only those who still know fear can understand the value of right and wrong. When people stop being afraid, they stop feeling ashamed of doing harm. Fear, when kept in its rightful place, keeps us from losing ourselves." The boy stayed silent, his lips moving slightly before he nodded. In the slanting sunlight, his eyes reflected the image of the man before him, not a hero's face, but that of an ordinary person who had once been afraid, who had fallen, and still stood again. Elijah placed a hand on the boy's shoulder light as an unspoken message, then turned and walked away, merging into the crowd flowing toward the center of the square. On the stage, above, the ceremony drew to a close, and the loudspeakers played a slow melody, each deep note descending like a soft blanket of memory over the gathering. The crowd began to disperse, but no one spoke loudly, as though each carried a small piece of silence newly planted in their hearts. There was no need for chants or banners, because everyone understood that what they were honoring no longer belonged to a single story, but to a moment when humanity relearned how to truly see one another. Elijah stopped at the edge of the square, the wind rising, stirring the flags until they rustled with a sound both gentle and resolute. The air fell completely still, broken only by the soft flutter of flags in the wind. The last light of day stretched across the red brick ground, glinting off the silver badges on every chest, making the square shimmer like it was covered in 1,000 tiny stars. In that moment, Havenbrook seemed to hold its breath, and everyone shared a feeling no one tried to name, a quiet reverence, a deep gratitude, and a faint ache for that afternoon long ago when a single flash of electricity awakened an entire nation. Elijah lifted his gaze toward the flagpole where the American flag rippled against the amber sky. He said nothing, but his eyes spoke clearly enough. Some memories, even when past, remain as reminders that justice, courage, and honest fear must always walk together to keep humanity from forgetting who they are. The wind stirred, carrying with it the distant sound of church bells, and across the silent square, only one sound remained, the flag's soft flutter chatter, blending with the heartbeat of a city that had learned to listen. That late afternoon in Havenbrook, the wind was calm, and sunlight poured through the glass windows, casting its glow on the square where the American flag still flew, a reminder of a story that once shook the nation, but had since become a memory preserved by silence and gratitude. Elijah Ward stood among the crowd like any ordinary man, watching the young faces as they pinned small badges to their shirts engraved with the words, "He was tased. We awoke." The phrase was no longer a reminder of pain, but the mark of a shared awakening, the journey of a nation learning to see itself anew through the story of a single man. From that afternoon at a small store where a spark of electricity flashed between two men, one holding a weapon, the other carrying honor to the days of chaos, debate, and finally silence, Havenbrook had lived through every shade of pain and awakening. Elijah had once been the victim of power, yet he never allowed himself to become a symbol of hatred. He chose to face it, to hold steady, to let composure become the language of dignity, reminding others that justice is not vengeance, but the quiet persistence of what is right. And it was that calm strength that had forced an entire system to change, from the Pentagon to Congress to the classrooms where a child once asked, if he hadn't been a colonel, would anyone have saved him? That question, small as it seemed, opened a wide door for a nation to confront what it had long avoided. When an old veteran wrote his son the letter, "Don't let the badge make you forget the eyes of a human being," what Elijah had begun had already grown beyond justice. It had become a lesson in humanity. Rick Talbot, who once believed himself an enforcer of the law and later broke down in tears listening to the news from his cell, stood as proof that awakening may come late, but it remains a kind of redemption. Elijah had never spoken ill of him, never demanded an apology, because he understood forgiveness is not weakness, but the only strength powerful enough to break the cycle of hate. A year later, when Elijah returned to the store where it all began, he didn't come to relive the pain, but to leave behind an old badge and a quiet reminder. Don't wipe away that burn mark. It was a message, not only for Maria but for the world, that collective wounds must be seen, not hidden. Above the counter, the small wooden sign with the words, "Respect begins here," reflected softly in the eyes of everyone who passed through. And in his own home, when he received General Abrams's letter, "You made justice more than a slogan." Elijah understood that the greatest thing he had done was not defeating anyone, but helping people believe in justice once more. The church bells rang again across the peaceful air, their sound weaving gently through every corner, blending with the rhythm of quiet life. Elijah looked out the window, his voice a faint murmur as if speaking only to himself. There are battles without guns that still demand courage. And indeed, that battle continued within every person, the struggle between fear and compassion, between silence and the courage to speak. Elijah was no longer the image of a victim, but of a man who chose to stand upright amid chaos, preserving his dignity without ever needing to raise his voice. His story did not end, continue. The silver badges still gleamed on people's chests each year, a reminder that justice is not a single moment, but a long journey sustained by small acts of decency. Havenbrook had changed, the nation had changed, but most of all, people had learned that sometimes all it takes is a calm gaze and a timely word to make the world fall silent and listen. And in that silence, justice is born not from the courts, but from courage.